This is Jack Move. This is a Western-made JRPG that is focusing on a cyberpunk theme, where you play as a girl named Noah, a sort of vigilante hacker type of person, who is trying to figure out some mysteries involving a giant megacorporation called Monomind, as well as her father's relation to them. And it of course also dives into themes like massive corporatization and the commodification of human life. It uses a 2D top-down art style as well as pretty classic turn-based gameplay, but with some pretty fun twists, all related to this whole hacker cyberpunk theme that very much worms its way into all of the game's mechanics, so let's get started. This is not a party-based game. You will only ever have one party member, Noah herself, although you are going to face multiple enemies at one time most of the time, so you are going to be outnumbered, and this is where a lot of the game's sort of weakness exploitation mechanics come in, but we'll get to the combat in just a minute. First of all, the world itself. It's a really well-realized cyberpunk world, and the art style is very much to do with this, because the art style of this game is, in my opinion, its absolute best aspect. Its sprite work and its environment art is all really, really good stuff. The animations during battle for both your character and for the enemies are really solid and have a lot of character to them, and the overall world itself has a really nice atmosphere to it. The way that it feels to stand in this sort of neon landscape with rain coming down and all this concrete everywhere, and it just feels really cool, and they've done an excellent job of bringing across a sort of cyberpunk slum to city kind of landscape with a lot of character. So you'll find that all of the animations and all of the environment art and all of the character interactions and all that stuff all looks extremely good. And in fact, it also sounds really good, because the soundscape to this game is excellent, both in terms of its environmental sound, its atmospheric stuff like the sound of rain, and also its music. Its music is very solid and ranges from a kind of chill, lounge, jazzy sort of soundtrack almost when you're exploring around safe areas, to a more upbeat, like, techno cyberpunk style of music that fits the aesthetic of the game very well, and I'm impressed with how much variety there is in the music. In particular, the boss themes are awesome and sound really, really good, and of course are very fitting for a very hectic battle like that, but all of the music is stellar. So yeah, the game's presentation, from its UI to its animations to its sprite work to its environment to its sound, it's all extremely solid, and like I said, is definitely the highest point of the game for me, just because of how well it's all packaged together in this really excellent cyberpunk presentation that has that classic atmosphere of like dystopic, hopeless hopefulness, if you get what I mean, where everything is really awful, but at the same time you're still sort of trying for a better future. It nails that really well. Your character progression is based around installing software and hardware. You have one hardware slot, but you can expand to up to 3 hardware slots later in the game, and these are basically like accessories in other JRPGs. They do things like giving you more RAM for installing software, or giving you certain resistances to certain elements, or making your software attacks more powerful, or all sorts of things like that. There are many of them, and they're pretty much all useful till the end of the game, it seems like, and you'll be finding and buying lots of these. Now, the software part, these are your skills and spells, effectively. You do have a basic attack, which is simply called a hack, and in this case, hack means punch them in the face. But if you want to do anything more fancy than that, then you have to install software, and you have a certain set amount of RAM that you start the game with, which you will expand as you go through the game, and different pieces of software take different amounts of RAM to equip. And this is where the sort of rock, paper, scissors elemental system of the game comes in. You have color-coded elements. There is cyberware, which is green, blue is electroware, and then you have wetware, which is a sort of pinkish color. You also have just basic physical, which is red. Different enemies will be weak to different kinds of elements, and all of your various pieces of software that you can equip will all do different elemental types of damage. And oftentimes, especially with the earlier enemies, they're sort of color-coded, so if you see a green enemy, they're probably a cyberware enemy and are thus weak to wetware. But as you go on, the sprites stop being quite so obvious, and you need like a scan skill or one of the pieces of hardware that allows you to see weaknesses to help you identify them. You'll start out with a couple of basic attacks like Glitch, which does just a basic amount of cyberware damage to an enemy, and you'll eventually get some more advanced stuff like, say, the Tier 3 attacks like Zombie, which does a lot of cyberware damage, and all of the Tier 3 attacks have really cool particle effects. In battle, by the way, all of the animations and particle effects look awesome, and they make the battle really satisfying. This is important, because in a JRPG, you're of course abstracted, you're separated from the battle. It's not an action RPG, you don't press button to punch man. You make a selection in the menu to punch man, or at least to make your character punch man. So that means there's always a bit of a layer of separation between you and the combat. So when it comes to JRPGs, having really satisfying sound assets, really good particle effects, really nice impact, this is what helps make the combat more satisfying, and this game does that really well. Even the basic hack punch to the face skill has a really nice sound effect to it that actually feels really impactful and nice. So yeah, I really like all of the, especially the Tier 3 particle effects for all the various skills in this game, and it makes them all feel unique, and it gives you sort of of a good visual theming for each one, like the fact that the wetware stuff is actually themed around like a sort of pinkish goop like actual water, as if it was literally wet, which is pretty clever. Electroware is generally lightning-related stuff that's very blue and pretty, and your green cyberware-related stuff is generally like constructs made of ones and zeros, so they do have a really nice visual theming to them. And it's all about having what you need to exploit enemy weaknesses, since it deals way more damage if you hit their weaknesses, and later on in the game you'll absolutely need to in order to survive battles, because enemies can do a lot of damage to you back, so you need to be able to beat them efficiently without using up all of your data points, your DP, which is basically MP, very inefficiently on things like healing. So you really need to dedicate your current RAM blocks, however many that you have at that time, to slotting in useful stuff that you need to exploit the weaknesses of the enemies you're currently encountering, as well as maybe some healing or some curative stuff depending on what they can do, because there are also subsystems, which is this game's word for status effects, both buffs and debuffs. And there are lots and lots of these that both you and the enemies can inflict each other with. So you've got things like overclock, which is basically haste. You can weaken their defenses to certain elements, and they can weaken your defenses to certain elements as well, or you can buff your own. There's actually quite a lot of skills that you can slot in, so it makes for a pretty cool selection of build variety that you can focus on. You know, you can choose to focus on different types of attacks, and as you use these skills in battle, you'll actually level them up. They'll gain experience separate from your own experience gauge, and as they level up, they just simply get stronger, better at what they do, all the way up to level 4 where they max out. There's even an install option when you're in battle itself, which allows you to actually slot out the various things that you're equipped with and actually slot in new ones just for that battle. So if you have a whole bunch of wetware abilities installed, but you come across something that's weak to electroware, you can actually slot them mid-battle and change your setup if you want to. And then there are, of course, the titular jack moves themselves, which are basically limit breaks. You have a JM gauge that fills up as you deal and take damage, and once it's full, you can use a jack move. And there are several of these, one for each of the damage types, and you'll get them as you progress the story. And these are kind of neat because they involve a little rhythm game at the beginning. When you cast them, you have to input 3 directions on a certain rhythm, and the directions are different for each of the jack moves. And it gives you a little metronome, which I really like when you're inputting these directions, just to help you out a little bit, very useful. And the more of these directions you get right, the more powerful the move will be, and if you get all of them perfectly, then it will be a guaranteed crit against all enemies. Jack moves are extremely powerful and have the most impressive and really cool particle effects or animations of all the attacks in the game. They look super neat. I'm very partial to the wormhole one and the flood one. They both look really awesome. But yeah, all the jack moves look super cool, and they're always worth saving for a boss fight and things because they deal tremendous damage if you get the rhythm part right. So they're definitely worth banking up for a tough battle, although they also don't take that long to charge, so they are worth using against regular enemies as well. The story is a pretty standard cyberpunk sci-fi story with a lot of the elements you've probably seen before, but it is executed well. Your father has a tangled history with this giant mega corporation called Monomind, and you're trying to figure out what is actually happening and what they're working on, and things go south and your friends get involved and all sorts of stuff happens, and it's actually a pretty good story. Like I said, it's relatively cliche, I guess you could say, because it's kind of expected, but it is done well, and it actually does have some twists that I wasn't expecting either, so it's not entirely predictable, and it is, in my opinion, quite a good story, mostly due to the fact that the characters are well written. The dialogue is actually quite good in this game, and the characters are likable. They feel like they have a realistic history, they feel like they interact with each other in a way that isn't just video game protagonist and friends, and they actually feel like people, you know, they feel human, and the way their writing comes across is very down to earth, and I really appreciate that in a sort of sci-fi story where things can sometimes get very abstracted and strange. It helps to have a very grounded main character. The story is very linear. You are going from place to place in a specific order. There are side quests, but there aren't that many, although they are actually worth doing because of the rewards, but there aren't tons of them to do, so it is a pretty short game. You will probably clock in around 9 or so hours for a playthrough, but I will say that number is actually not too bad. Although it is short for a JRPG, it is all killer, no filler, basically, because I never felt the need to grind or repeat a bunch of stuff or anything like that. Pretty much the entire story, it was 9 hours of content and story progression in a nice flow. It wasn't 6 hours of content and then 3 hours of grinding, you know what I mean? It was actually pretty well paced to the point where I never actually felt the need to stop the pace and then go do like 30 or 40 battles to get some levels and then go back to the story. That was never required. So it is a relatively short RPG, but it is paced in a way that actually feels quite good, and the story unravels at a nice sort of flow. Now, there is one major disadvantage to having a much more compressed JRPG experience, and I think this game actually handles it pretty well, in my opinion at least, and that is character development. Because if you have a very compressed JRPG experience, your characters don't get to develop as much because it's a shorter game, and in a lot of JRPGs, your characters will start as a not quite blank slate, but in a sort of a basic arc, and then they will develop a lot towards the end of the game. But in this game, the characters sort of start already like 75% developed, and you only are seeing the other like 25% chunk of their development, if you get what I mean. Which I think is preferable, because the other way to do character development in a really short JRPG is to have them start like they normally would in a more classic game, but not have enough time to develop, so they end up as kind of nothing characters. They end up sort of hollow. And I much prefer this game's way of doing it, where, yeah, they are already established characters by the time the game starts, but there is still a development arc that's actually happening. There is still meaningful development that's happening. It's just compressed. And I think that if you are going to make a short-form JRPG, that's pretty much the only good way to do it, because the other option is just to barely have characters, you know, and that's not good enough. So this game does a good job, in my opinion, with what it actually presents to you by giving you a believable story with fun characters that actually feel like characters. So overall, I actually think that Jack Move is a pretty fantastic game. It is very short, for sure, but it is very enjoyable all the way through. It doesn't have any bits that feel like a slog or that feel like you need to grind. The storyline has some nice twists, the characters are actually fun to interact with and are written well, and the animation work, the sprite work, the environment art, and the music is all absolutely stellar, top-notch stuff. So yeah, definitely I would recommend Jack Move if you're a fan of JRPGs, or if you like cyberpunk media, or if you just think it looks awesome and want to give it a shot. So the link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you would like to check it out yourself. It is available now. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.